On a Tuesday evening in February 1963, a woman named Edna Crossley in Halifax looked at the coal bunker in her backyard and counted what was left. There were perhaps 4 hundredweight, she thought, possibly 5. It was the coldest winter Britain had experienced since 1947, and the coal man had not been able to get through for 11 days because the roads in the upper part of the town were impassable. Edna was calculating whether what was in the bunker would last until Thursday, which was when the coal merchant had promised a delivery if the roads cleared, and whether she needed to reduce the fire in the back room to make the remaining coal stretch. This is a worry that nobody under the age of 50 has ever had. Number 15 on this list was the private anxiety of virtually every housewife in working class and lower middle class Britain and across Northern Europe every Saturday morning throughout the post-war decades. And it would be incomprehensible to anyone who has grown up with a supermarket available at any hour of any day of the week. Number 8 was the specific dread of the working-class household during the power cuts and industrial disputes of the early 1970s, and it produced a set of practical preparations that the modern household has entirely lost the knowledge of. And number 1, the worry at the very top of this list, was not the anxiety of poverty or disaster. It was the quiet, constant, background concern of every responsible adult in post-war Europe who understood that the margin between sufficiency and difficulty was smaller and more immediate than anything the modern consumer economy has left its participants able to imagine. These are 20 things that your European grandparents worried about that nobody worries about anymore. The practical anxieties of working-class and lower-middle-class life in Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands between the late 1940s and the mid-1980s, worries that have been dissolved by technology, by prosperity, by regulation, and by the structural changes to the economy that made most of them genuinely unnecessary. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because understanding what previous generations worried about is not merely an exercise in nostalgia, it is the most direct route to understanding what they valued, how they managed, and what they built their daily lives to protect. Let us count them down. Number 20, whether the coal would last the week. The coal fire was the primary source of domestic heat in the working-class European home from the Victorian era through to the 1970s, and the coal bunker in the backyard was the household's energy reserve. A working-class household in Britain in the early 1960s burned between 1 and 2 hundredweight of coal per week in cold weather, and the bunker that held perhaps 8 to 10 hundredweight provided between 4 and 10 weeks of heat, depending on the weather and consumption. The specific anxiety of a cold February morning with a low bunker and an uncertain coalman's schedule has been replaced by the standing order to the gas supplier and the thermostat on the boiler, and the replacement is so complete that the original anxiety is now difficult to reconstruct even for those who lived through it. Number 19, whether the rent would stretch to Friday. The working-class household of the post-war decades was managed on a weekly cycle in which income arrived on Friday in a wage packet and was expected to reach the following Friday without running out. The worry about whether the money would stretch was not the anxiety of destitution. It was the practical concern of a household manager who knew the margin precisely, who had calculated the week's expenditure against the week's income, and who understood that an unexpected cost of £2 or £3, a shoe that needed replacing, a child who needed a prescription, could make the balance negative in a way that had no easy remedy in an era before consumer credit was available as a normalized solution. Number 18, whether the television aerial would hold up in the wind. Before cable and satellite and streaming, the television reception of every household in Britain and across continental Europe depended on a directional aerial mounted on the chimney stack, oriented to receive the transmitter signal and left in position until wind, corrosion, or mechanical failure altered its orientation. A household whose aerial had been slightly shifted by the previous night's wind woke to a degraded picture, and the worry about the aerial's condition was a recurring minor anxiety that accompanied every storm. The man who climbed onto the roof with a pair of pliers to adjust the aerial back to its correct position was performing a practical task that his modern equivalent, whose television receives its signal through a buried cable or a weatherproof satellite dish, has no occasion to perform or even to understand. Number 17, whether the post office would be open on Saturday afternoon. The post office in the working-class European high street closed on Saturday at 12:30 or 1 o'clock, and the postal and financial business that could only be transacted at the post office counter needed to be accomplished before that closing time. The worry about whether there was time to reach the post office before it closed on a Saturday was a recurring practical anxiety for the households whose administrative lives depended on it. The weekly post office savings deposit, the renewal of the road fund license, the pension collection that needed to happen before the cash ran out. Number 16, whether the car would start on a cold morning. Before fuel injection systems and electronic engine management, the carbureted engine of the family car required manual choke operation, careful management of the accelerator during warm-up, and the realistic possibility that none of this would work on a sufficiently cold morning. The working man who relied on his car to get to work on a cold January morning in 1971 woke with a specific anxiety about whether the car would start that has no modern equivalent. The ritual of the cold start attempt, the initial turn of the key, the holding of the breath, the flood of relief, or the sinking of the heart depending on the engine's response, was a daily experience for millions of car owners throughout the era of the carbureted engine that has been entirely abolished by subsequent technology. Number 15. Whether there would be enough at the butcher's by the time you got there on Saturday morning. The working-class Saturday morning shopping expedition was conducted under a specific temporal pressure that the supermarket has abolished. The butcher's shop, the bakers, the fishmongers, the greengrocers all operated on Saturday with limited stock that would be exhausted by mid-morning for the most popular items. A woman who arrived at the butcher's after 10 o'clock on a busy Saturday might find that the best cuts had already gone, that the specific piece she had intended to buy for Sunday's roast was no longer available. The anxiety of the Saturday morning shopping expedition, the pressure to be there early enough to secure what was needed, has been entirely replaced by the supermarket's always available stock and online ordering with next-day delivery. First pattern break. Here is where things get interesting. Because the worries described so far have been primarily logistical anxieties, worries about supply and access and timing, that technology and the restructuring of retail have simply abolished. But the next entries describe a different kind of worry, the social and relational anxieties of a community in which everyone knew everyone else and in which the opinions of neighbors, employers, and community institutions had genuine practical consequences for the household. Number 14. What the neighbors would think. The working-class European neighborhood of the post-war decades was a community of genuine mutual visibility in which the behavior, the appearance, and the household management of every resident was observed, discussed, and evaluated by those around them. The worry about what the neighbors would think was not mere social vanity. It was the practical concern of a household that depended on the goodwill of its neighbors for 100 small kindnesses, shared tools, borrowed cups of sugar, help in emergencies, and the invisible network of mutual assistance that made the tight margins of working-class life manageable. When the mobility of the workforce and the anonymity of the modern suburb reduced the interdependence of neighbors, the worry about what the neighbors thought lost its practical content. Number 13. Whether the rent collector would come before the housekeeping money was restocked. The rent collector who visited every working-class household on a weekly basis to collect the rent in cash required the household to have the specific sum available on the specific day he called. A household that was short of the rent on the collection day was in an awkward social position. The rent collector knew, the landlord would be told, and the small but real humiliation of being unable to produce the rent at the expected moment was added to the practical difficulty of being short. The worry about having the rent ready for the collector was a weekly recurrence in every household that paid this way, a small but consistent pressure that required the rent to be the first allocation from the wage packet. Number 12. Whether the electricity meter would run out at an inconvenient moment. Many working-class households in Britain and across Northern Europe used prepayment electricity meters that required coins to be inserted to maintain the supply. The meter that ran out of coins in the middle of cooking the Sunday dinner or during the children's bath time required an immediate response, the search for the correct coins, the insertion in the dark if the lights had already gone out. The worry about whether there were enough coins for the electricity meter was a background concern managed by the habit of keeping a supply of the correct denomination on the shelf beside the meter. When direct debit payment and smart meters replaced the prepayment coin meter, this specific domestic anxiety was abolished. Number 11. Whether the hire purchase payments would be met. The hire purchase agreement that covered the family's television, washing machine, and occasionally the furniture in the car was a long-term fixed commitment that needed to be honored, regardless of the week's other pressures, because the failure to meet a hire purchase payment could result in the goods being repossessed, meaning the loss of both the goods and all the payments already made. The worry about hire purchase was the working-class family's equivalent of the modern credit score anxiety, specific and practical and directly connected to the household's ability to maintain its standard of living. Second pattern break. This next one is where the most personal anxieties lived, because the worries described so far have been primarily about money and supply and social reputation. But the next entries describe the health and safety anxieties that pervaded the working-class European household, anxieties that were in many cases more rationally grounded than modern equivalents because the risks they addressed were more immediate, more personal, and less mediated by the institutional systems that now stand between the individual and the worst outcomes. Number 10. Whether the baby's breathing was normal in the night. The infant mortality rate in Britain and across Europe in the early post-war decades was significantly higher than it is today, and the working-class mother of the 1950s and 1960s who got up in the night to check that the baby was breathing was not being neurotic. She was responding to a real and statistically significant risk in an era before infant health monitoring, the health visitor service, and the reliable pediatric advice that have made sudden infant death genuinely rare. The specific anxiety of new parenthood in the 1950s and 1960s was grounded in a mortality risk that has since been substantially reduced, and the monitoring that worried parents performed, the hand on the baby's back, the ear close to the crib, was the only monitoring technology available to them. Number 9. Whether the winter cough would turn into something worse. In the era before antibiotics were universally available, the winter cough that might become bronchitis, that might become pneumonia, that in a previous decade might have become tuberculosis, was a source of genuine anxiety for the working-class household in which the health of the breadwinner was the financial foundation of the family's security. A working man who lost 3 weeks of work to pneumonia in 1955 lost 3 weeks of wages in an era before statutory sick pay was comprehensive, and the financial consequences of serious illness were both immediate and lasting. Number 8. Whether there would be enough candles and matches if the power cuts came back. The power cuts of the early 1970s, the product of the industrial disputes between the government and the miners, produced a set of practical preparations in working-class households across Britain that have since been entirely forgotten. The household that maintained a stock of candles, a supply of matches, and a battery-powered radio was responding rationally to a real and recent experience of supply interruption that the modern household, entirely dependent on uninterrupted electricity for its basic functions, has no framework for managing. The specific anxiety of the power cut era, the assessment of the candle supply, the location of the matches, the question of whether the gas stove could be lit by hand if the electric igniter was dead, produced a set of household preparations that have been entirely lost from the modern household's repertoire. Number 7. Whether the bicycle would be stolen if left outside. Before cars were universal and before the bicycle became primarily a leisure item, the bicycle was the primary transport of millions of working-class Europeans, the means by which the worker got to his factory and the child got to school. The loss of a bicycle was a genuine hardship, and the worry about bicycle theft was a constant background anxiety for households whose transport and whose employment depended on the machine that stood in the backyard or leaned against the workplace wall. Number 6. Whether there would be enough work next week. The employment insecurity of the working-class European of the post-war decades was the specific practical concern of the man whose employer operated on seasonal demand, on order fluctuations, and on the industrial relations that could close the factory for a week without notice. The working-class man in Britain in the 1960s, who was employed on a casual basis, who worked the docks, or the building sites, or the seasonal agricultural labor, understood his employment as precarious in ways that required the household to maintain reserves and strategies that the regularly employed household could afford to ignore. Third pattern break. Here is where the story becomes most personal. Because the final entries describe not logistical or financial anxieties, but the existential worries of the working-class European household that were as constant and as unremarkable as the weather, the background radiation of a way of life that offered genuine satisfactions and genuine security, but that never allowed the suspension of the practical vigilance on which that security depended. Number 5. Whether the children would get through the winter without serious illness. The working-class mother of the 1950s and 1960s managed the health of her children through a winter that presented genuine risks: scarlet fever, diphtheria, measles, whooping cough, all of which were not yet fully controlled by vaccination in the early post-war period. The worry was not merely about the children's health in isolation. It was about the household's capacity to manage a sick child without professional assistance in an era when the doctor's visit cost money and when the mother's time was the only nursing resource available. Number 4. Whether the rent book was in order. The rent book, in which the rent collector recorded each payment, was the working-class tenant's primary evidence of good standing with their landlord, and the anxiety about its completeness and accuracy was a practical concern for the household that might at some point need to demonstrate its reliability as a tenant in order to secure new housing or to dispute an eviction. A rent book with gaps or disputed entries was a liability that the careful tenant managed by keeping it meticulously and by challenging any entry that seemed incorrect before it became the established record. Number 3. Whether there would be enough food if someone came unexpectedly. The working-class European household of the post-war decades did not have the refrigerator full of food and the online grocery order available on 40 minutes' notice that makes the unexpected guest a pleasure in the modern household. The larder that contained the week's precisely calculated food supply could not easily accommodate an additional mouth at the table without adjustment, and the worry about having enough food for an unexpected visitor was a recurring low-level anxiety that the modern household's food security has entirely abolished. Number 2. Whether the money would hold out until pension day. The pensioner of the post-war European decades lived on a state pension that was paid weekly and collected in person from the post office on a specific day. The anxiety of the pensioner in the days before pension day, the calculation of whether the remaining money would cover the necessary expenditure until the next collection, was one of the most persistent and least remarked anxieties of older age in the post-war decades. The specific vulnerability of the weekly pensioner, dependent on a single predictable payment for the entirety of their income, with no savings buffer and no credit access, produced a management discipline in the older household that was as precise and as pressured as the wage packet discipline of the working household. Number 1. The worry that the margin was too thin to absorb a single unexpected event. At the very top of this list, above the coal bunker and the Saturday morning shopping and the hire purchase and the rent collector, sits not a specific worry, but the general condition of tight margin living that produced all the other worries on this list and gave them their emotional weight. The working-class European household of the post-war decades was managed to a margin so thin that a single unexpected expenditure, a broken appliance, a medical bill, a week of lost wages, a necessary repair that could not be deferred, could shift the household from sufficiency to difficulty in a way that required weeks of careful recovery. It was not poverty in the absolute sense. Food was available, housing was maintained, children were clothed and schooled. But the margin between the income and the necessary expenditure was narrow enough that the unexpected always posed a genuine threat to the household's stability, and the management of that margin, the constant quiet vigilance of the housewife, who knew exactly where every penny was the central practical task of domestic life. When consumer credit arrived in the 1980s and prosperity reduced the real cost of essentials, the margin widened for most households, and the specific vigilance that the narrow margin had required became unnecessary. What replaced it was not financial peace of mind, it was the illusion of financial peace of mind, purchased on credit, backed by assets whose values were assumed to be permanently rising, and maintained at the cost of the discipline that the narrow margin had enforced. Your grandparents worried about the coal and the rent and the hire purchase and the electricity meter, not because they were anxious people or because their lives were joyless. They worried because the margin was real, the vigilance was necessary, and the knowledge of exactly where things stood was the most important knowledge a household manager could possess. They did not call it financial literacy, they called it keeping on top of things, and they were right. The knowledge is still here. They knew, now you know too.